Okay, the biggest part of the United Nations is, you can think of it as similar to our Congress, and that's the General Assembly. And in the General Assembly, all nations who are members of the United Nations, which I can't think of a nation in the world who is not at this time, have one vote. The United Nations meets every fall, and they can only recommend actions. So for example, if they vote to end religious discrimination in all nations, they can pass that. Other nations don't have to adhere to it because it's only a recommendation. The Secretary General. The Secretary General is kind of like the President of the United Nations, the executive officer. He handles the day-to-day operation, and most of these agencies that you see on here are underneath him. He's elected by the General Assembly for renewable 5-year terms, and he's responsible for the day-to-day administration of the entire organization. There's also different regional groups within the United Nations. Those groups include the Asia Group, the Africa Group, the Latin American and Caribbean Island Group, Western European and Others Group, and the Eastern European Group. And as a nation, you are actually assigned to one of these groups. Now, can anybody guess why it's Western European and Others Group? I'll give you a hint. Think back to last week. What were you studying? Who might be in the Others Group? No? Close. A little to the right. If most of the Asia group is dominated by Muslim countries, who else is in Asia that's not really a Muslim country that might feel a little left out? Israel, exactly. So Israel's in the Western European, and they're the other, in the Others group. Now each one of these groups will select a representative to go to the Security Council, which we'll talk about tomorrow. So that's why they have these groups. Now, just like the Congress has Republicans and Democrats, and they also have the Black Congressional Caucus, the Latin American Congressional Caucus, the Pro-Life Caucus, the Pro-Choice Caucus, the United Nations has their own political groups also. These other groups, there's the G77 and China. The G77 are 77 developing nations who don't feel that they're the big powers in the United Nations. So they've got together to caucus and kind of come to big block votes to protect their own interests within the United Nations against what they perceive to be the imperialist colonial powers in the United Nations. Who can give me an example of an imperialist colonial power in the United Nations in the perception of these other nations? What a big hint, you live in one. The United States. Then there's the non-aligned movement. Now, back during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement was very popular because it was a grouping of countries who were not either for the United States or for the Soviet Union. They formed a bloc to carry on their own self-interest. It still exists today, but now they're less concerned with the sides in the Cold War as they are with carrying on the interests of developing nations. Most of these in the non-aligned movement are the same as the G77. There's the League of Arab States. I think that's pretty self-explanatory as to what that is. There's the European Union. There are also these things called NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They wield a great deal of authority within the United Nations, though normally they're not an official body or agency of the organization. Some are certified to observe and work with the United Nations. They have their own offices there. They'll have representatives go around and meet with people. There are other NGOs who are just as prominent but don't have an official recognition at the United Nations to conduct business there on the premises. Now, can anybody give me some examples of an NGO? Of a non-governmental organization that might have some effect? Well, I guess in a way they're NGOs, but they're not the kind who are searching for the same principles as the United Nations. Yeah. How about some that are? How about some peaceful organizations? Anybody? How about the International Red Cross? What's some other ones who really have an impact on a lot of nations? Maybe they aren't certified. Maybe you wouldn't think of them as having an office at the United Nations. Kind of think outside the box. Who?
Like the Peace Corps.
The Peace Corps. It's a good one. In a way, that's really an agency of the United States government, though. What are some non-governmental ones? Who? Caterpillar. Corporations. There are some corporations whose annual revenue is greater than most small countries' gross domestic product. So corporations are real important. Caterpillar being one. Caterpillar wields a lot of authority in the Eastern European group. Anybody think of another one?
State Farm.
State Farm.
Oh, good job.
How about outside? How about other than corporations? What about labor unions? Group like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Union.
Yep.